It all started on a calm Tuesday morning in a small southern town diner. One of those places where time seemed to slow down. The scent of crispy bacon and fresh coffee hung in the air, and the quiet clink of utensils on plates mixed with the occasional burst of laughter from familiar conversations. It was a place where regulars came not just for the food, but for the comfort of routine, where the waitress already knew your order by the time you sat down, and where newcomers were rare. That morning, the door swung open with a soft jingle, and two elderly black men stepped inside. The hush that fell over the room wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. They moved with deliberate grace, their bodies slowed by age, but still strong. Each wore a military jacket, faded from time, but carefully maintained. The patches told stories. One had served in Korea, the other in Vietnam. Medals glinted subtly under the diner's soft light. The men nodded to the hostess, who seemed uncertain, then slid into a booth in the back corner, away from the large window, but near enough to the register to be seen. They spoke quietly, their voices low and respectful, their mannerisms calm and practiced. They weren't here to make a scene. They just wanted coffee, maybe some eggs and toast. A quiet breakfast shared between brothers in arms. But the peace of the morning wouldn't last. Across the diner, seated alone with his breakfast untouched, was a uniformed police officer. He was young, maybe mid-30s, and clearly on edge. His eyes kept flicking toward the booth where the men sat. It wasn't curiosity in his gaze. It was suspicion, something deeper, something old, something that shouldn't still exist but did. After several long minutes, the officer stood, adjusted his belt, and walked toward the booth with purpose. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Excuse me," the officer said, voice raised just enough for the entire diner to hear. He placed his hands on his hips, thumb near his holster. "Are you two supposed to be here? You look out of place." A fork clattered to the floor somewhere near the counter. The waitress froze mid-pour. Conversations died in throats. All eyes turned to the corner booth. The man closest to the officer looked up slowly, calmly. His eyes were clear and steady. Eyes that had seen jungles burning, comrades dying, and a nation asking too much of him, then offering too little in return. His voice, when he spoke, was measured but firm. "I beg your pardon, officer. I asked if you were supposed to be here," the officer repeated. "This isn't exactly your usual place, is it?" The second man chuckled softly, more of a scoff. "We're not lost, if that's what you're asking. We came here for breakfast. Same as anyone." "You don't need to be hostile," the officer said, shifting his stance. "We're not," the first man said, "but your tone makes it clear you're looking for trouble where there is none." There was a long silence, heavy and suffocating. The officer seemed to struggle with his next move. His eyes scanned the room, maybe looking for support, but none came. No nods, no affirmations, just tense faces watching and waiting. Finally, an elderly white woman at the counter stood up. She walked over with a slight limp, her cane tapping softly on the floor. She looked the officer squarely in the eye. "These men have more right to be here than most of us," she said. "I remember when they left this town in uniform. Boys back then, fighting for this country while folks like you stayed safe." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "Why don't you sit back down and finish your breakfast, officer? You're making more of a mess than you're worth." Shamed and exposed, the officer hesitated, then turned and walked back to his seat. The diner slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed, cautiously at first, then with more ease. At the corner booth, the two veterans sipped their coffee. They hadn't come looking for a fight, but they'd faced worse and stood tall. And this time, they weren't alone. The two veterans looked at each other calmly. Mr. Harris, a retired Army sergeant in his late 60s with silver hair beneath his cap and a face etched with the quiet lines of decades of service, sat tall in his seat. His voice was steady, low, and respectful when he said, "Is there a problem, officer?" The cop, eyes narrowed and jaw tight, leaned in further. He ignored Harris's even tone, focusing instead on the authority his uniform gave him. "Mind showing me some ID?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "I don't recall seeing you around here. People like you tend to stir up trouble." The air changed instantly. There was a sharp intake of breath from a few nearby tables. One waitress, standing with a notepad in her hand, dropped her pen. A man eating grits at the counter froze with his spoon halfway to his mouth. The second veteran, Mr. Daniels, a former Marine with a steady gaze and an unmistakable don't-push-it demeanor, didn't even look up from his coffee. "We came here for breakfast," he said coolly, "not a background check." That should have been the end of it. But the officer wasn't backing down. He crossed his arms and muttered just loud enough for those closest to hear, "You two better not cause any issues here. I've dealt with your kind before." And that was it. The moment everything shifted. From the far corner of the diner, a young woman, no more than 25, with a laptop open and earbuds half out, stood up. She had been listening the whole time, her eyes flicking from screen to scene, unsure at first if she should get involved. But now, it was clear to her and everyone else that someone needed to say something. She walked across the diner floor with purpose. Her black curls were pulled into a bun, and a college sweatshirt hung loosely from her frame. When she reached the table, she turned not to the veterans, but to the officer. "That's enough," she said firmly. "You're harassing them." The officer looked taken aback. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she said, her voice louder now, cutting through the diner's tension like a knife. "You asked for ID. They said no. You kept pushing. You made a racist comment. I'm recording everything now, and I'll be sharing it." She held up her phone, screen lit, camera rolling. The officer straightened, blinking in disbelief. "You don't understand." "No, I understand perfectly," she cut in. "You saw two elderly black men and assumed they didn't belong. You tried to intimidate them. But they've earned their place in this country more than you'll ever know." Around the diner, people were watching. A man in a trucker hat gave a small nod. The waitress who had dropped her pen picked it up, her hands shaking slightly, but her face resolute. The cop looked around, realizing just how alone he was. No one came to his defense. Not a single voice backed him up. Mr. Harris finally spoke again, his tone soft but commanding. "We faced worse than this, young lady," he said to her. "But thank you." The officer took a step back, lips pursed. He glanced once more around the diner and muttered, "Enjoy your meal," before turning and heading toward the door. He didn't finish his breakfast. The young woman sat down at the booth beside the veterans. "You shouldn't have to deal with that," she said. Daniel smiled, for the first time since he walked in. "We shouldn't. But today, we didn't have to deal with it alone." In that small southern diner, something powerful had happened. The kind of moment that lingers. Not just a confrontation, but a stand. A quiet shift. A new voice joining the old ones. "Excuse me, officer," the young woman said confidently, stepping forward with a calm fire in her eyes. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang clear and steady across the hushed diner. "These men are decorated U.S. veterans. I don't know what you think they're doing wrong, but profiling them because of how they look is not only wrong, it's illegal." A stunned silence followed her words, the kind that hangs in the air like a held breath. The officer turned sharply toward her, his eyes narrowing into a glare. "Mind your business, miss," he snapped, his voice low but threatening. But she didn't flinch. "Actually, I will make it my business," she said, standing her ground. "Because one of these men," she pointed directly at Mr. Harris, "was my grandfather's commanding officer in Iraq. I recognize him. He served this country long before I was even born." At that, Mr. Harris looked up, his brows raised in genuine surprise. For a moment, his stern composure gave way to something softer, astonishment, maybe even pride. He studied her face carefully. She had the same determined look he remembered from one of the young men under his command, a young corporal who used to carry a photo of his baby granddaughter in his helmet liner. The young woman continued, her voice steady and resolute. "And I'm pre-law, so unless you have a legal reason to detain or question them, I suggest you leave them alone before this becomes a lawsuit or a viral video." By now, the diner had shifted completely. The quiet murmurs had ceased. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter. A young couple at the window had their phones out, cameras aimed steadily at the officer. An older man in a John Deere hat gave a small, approving nod. There was no confusion now. Everyone knew what was happening, and no one was looking away. The officer hesitated, his expression faltering as he glanced around the room. His authority, once unquestioned, was slipping. The tables had turned. He was the one under scrutiny now. "You don't understand," he began, his voice laced with defensiveness. "No," the young woman cut him off. "You don't understand. These men are heroes. They don't owe you an explanation, a badge, or an apology for existing in a public space. The days of intimidation without consequence are over." Mr. Daniels, silent until now, chuckled quietly under his breath. "She's got more backbone than half the officers I served with," he said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. He lifted his coffee and took a sip like nothing had happened. Mr. Harris turned to the young woman. "Your grandfather wouldn't shut up about you," he said warmly. "Said you'd change the world one day." She smiled, visibly moved, but kept her focus. "Let's start with this diner." The officer looked down, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled on his shoulders. He gave one last glance around the room. Every camera, every face, every eye watching, and then stepped back. "Have a good day," he muttered, retreating toward the door. He didn't finish his coffee. He didn't even look back. The young woman let out a breath and looked at the two veterans. "May I sit?" "Please do," Mr. Harris said, gesturing to the booth. She slid in beside them. The waitress brought over a fresh pot of coffee without being asked, refilling their mugs with a shaking hand. But now, a small smile too. The room slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed, but something was different. Something had shifted, not just because one brave young woman had spoken up, but because her words reminded everyone in that diner of something too often forgotten. That dignity, respect, and justice aren't just ideas. They're choices made in the moment. And on that Tuesday morning, in a small southern diner, those choices echoed louder than hate ever could. The tension in the diner had reached its breaking point when the heavy back door near the kitchen swung open. From behind the counter emerged Linda, the owner of the diner. A woman in her early 70s with silver-streaked hair, pulled into a tight bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Linda had been running the place for nearly 40 years. Everyone in town knew her, firm but fair, never one to bite her tongue when it counted. She wiped her hands on her apron as she approached the growing scene near the corner booth. Her voice was clear, resolute, and carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen a lot in her lifetime. "Officer," she said firmly, "these men are regulars here. They served our country, and they deserve our respect. If anyone's causing a problem in my diner, it's you." The officer, caught completely off guard by Linda's interruption, looked down at the floor for a moment. His face flushed crimson, a sharp contrast against the pale blue of his uniform. He opened his mouth to speak, then faltered. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled weakly, casting a glance at the booths full of silent diners and raised phones. Linda took a step closer, eyes locked on his. "Doing your job?" she repeated. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass peaceful patrons because of the color of their skin." He tried again to defend himself, grasping for words. I thought they looked suspicious." Linda didn't budge. "Suspicious? These men have been coming here every Tuesday for years. They fought in wars most people don't even remember. They've seen more hardship and shown more discipline than half the town put together." The officer glanced nervously toward the door. A few chuckles rang out from the crowd. Not mocking, just sharp with truth. Linda wasn't finished. "You're harassing people based on their race and assuming guilt with no reason. That's not law enforcement. That's intimidation. And it's not welcome here. Not in my diner. Not in this town." For a moment, there was absolute silence. The kind that feels like the whole room is holding its breath. Then, slowly, someone at the counter started clapping. Another joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire diner erupted in applause. Not loud or rowdy, but steady, deliberate, and full of quiet defiance. The officer stood there for one more uncomfortable moment, as if unsure whether to say something else or disappear. Realizing he had no more allies in the room, he gave one last half-hearted warning. "Just be careful," he muttered, and without another word, turned on his heel and pushed through the front door. It shut behind him with a hollow thud. As he left, the atmosphere in the diner seemed to exhale all at once. Conversations resumed, though more subdued than before. A sense of unity hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. Linda turned to Mr. Harris and Mr. Daniels. "I'm so sorry, gentlemen. That should have never happened." Mr. Harris gave her a small smile and tipped his head. "We appreciate it, Linda. And your eggs are still the best in town." She laughed, her eyes a little glassy, and patted his shoulder. "Your breakfast is on the house today, and next week, too." The young woman with the laptop, still seated nearby, smiled as she packed up her things. She'd recorded the entire incident, but perhaps more importantly, she'd watched the town stand up for its own. In a place once silent in the face of injustice, voices had risen. And for one Tuesday morning, in one small southern diner, decency
After
had
the
won.
officer
Stormed out, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a hollow finality. The energy in the diner slowly began to settle. It was as if a thunderstorm had passed through, tense, charged, but now clearing. People returned to their meals with glances of respect toward the corner booth. The cameras were lowered, but something deeper had shifted in the room, an unspoken recognition of what had just occurred, and who had stood tall through it. At the booth, the two veterans quietly resumed their breakfast. Mr. Daniels, always the more wry of the two, took a bite of his toast, chewed thoughtfully, and then chuckled. "Didn't think breakfast would turn into a civil rights lesson," he said with a smirk, shaking his head. Mr. Harris, stirring his coffee, gave a low laugh. "These days, every lesson's worth repeating." Then he looked over at the young woman who had stood up for them, still sitting nearby, her laptop now closed, her phone buzzing with notifications. "You remind me of the people we fought for," he said, voice rich with quiet pride. "Brave and willing to speak truth, no matter who's listening." The young woman met his gaze, her eyes bright but steady. "And you remind me why we should never stop fighting for what's right," she said. "You live the battles. I've only read about them. But it's people like you who taught the rest of us what courage really looks like." Across the room, Linda refilled their coffees herself. She didn't say much, just gave them each a warm smile and a hand on the shoulder, one veteran to another in silent gratitude. Her presence said what words couldn't. "I got your back." By that afternoon, the story had already made its way beyond the walls of the diner. Several patrons had posted video clips from their phones, and within hours, the footage had begun to spread across social media platforms. In one clip, the young woman's sharp rebuke and unwavering stance went viral. In another, Linda's declaration, "That's not welcome here," was quoted thousands of times. The internet responded with force. Comment sections overflowed with praise. Messages from veterans, civil rights advocates, young students, and everyday Americans poured in. They applauded the two elderly servicemen for their dignity and calm in the face of provocation. They hailed the young woman as a modern-day hero, someone unafraid to stand between injustice and its targets. And Linda, the diner owner who had chosen principle over politeness, was called a local legend and a pillar of moral leadership. Within 24 hours, the local police department issued a statement confirming the officer involved had been placed under internal review, citing conduct unbecoming of his role and promising a thorough and immediate investigation. Public pressure was mounting. The town's mayor, pressed by journalists, called the incident deeply troubling and pledged to address systemic bias. But for those inside that little diner, it wasn't about trending videos or online recognition. It was about what had been proven. Respect doesn't come from a uniform or a badge or an air of authority. It's not something you can command with intimidation. It's something you earn with action, with integrity, with the courage to stand up for others, especially when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. Mr. Harris and Mr. Daniels had earned that respect long ago, on foreign soil, in the midst of battle, and later, in the quiet fight for equality back home. And now, long after their wars had ended, they were still teaching those around them what real strength looked like. This wasn't just a story about a confrontation in a small-town diner. It was a reminder. Justice can start with a whisper, courage can begin with a single voice, and dignity, real, unshakable dignity, doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to stand.